leading to a serious health problem for people in the United States. Every time I turn the TV on, it seems like I hear about another recall from Salmonella or E. coli contamination. Everything from Jack in the Box hamburgers to spinach to leafy greens, even Peter Pan peanut butter. What do all these things have in common, and what is the cause of the problem? You'll see in the next slide. The answer to the question, why are we having so many recalls, lies largely in factory farming, in particular in feedlot life, where cattle and hogs are raised in such large concentrations that their urine and their feces runs off, contaminating rivers and streams and eventually contaminating our produce, resulting in the recalls, and I would add, the loss of life that we have heard so much about. Not only does our water supply get contaminated from feedlot life, but the very beef and pork that we eat is also contaminated. Cows stand ankle deep in feces, and when they arrive at the slaughterhouse, their hides are covered with feces. Many of the animals get sick and die, and many of them work their way into the food supply where we later consume them. Knowing that they're likely to be contaminated with E. coli, a hamburger filler, for example, is washed in ammonia to kill the E. coli. One would think that if an animal was too sick to walk, that it absolutely would not make its way to the slaughterhouse and be processed into our food supply, but that's not the case. The largest beef recall in U.S. history, 143 million pounds of beef, was caused by downed cattle working their way into our food supply. According to Mike O'Gregor, MD, by allowing downed cattle into the food supply, we are increasing the risk of human exposure to mad cow disease, Salmonella, E. coli, and other food poisonings. Unfortunately, factory farming is primarily about profit and productivity and has very little to do with the health of the animal, or for that matter, with the health of we, the consumers. It used to be that it took 70 days to raise a chicken, and now that same chicken can be raised in 48 days. And according to Carly Morrison, when in 7 weeks you have a 5.5-pound chicken, their internal organs can't keep up with the rapid growth. A lot of them can only take a few steps and then they plop down. What you're looking at here, folks, are dead chickens being removed from a hen house. They couldn't survive even the 7 weeks it takes to bring them to market. According to Carly Morrison, there are antibiotics put into the feed that pass through the chicken. The bacteria builds up a resistance and they aren't working anymore. She goes on to say regarding herself and her personal health, I have become allergic to all antibiotics. I ask you folks, in particular you moms out there, what is it that we're feeding to our children? If these animals have to be given growth hormones and constant antibiotics because they're living in their own feces and they become antibiotic resistant, what is eating them doing to us and our health? Could you be eating meat that's rotten and not even know it? The answer is yes. Representative Bart Stubeck, Democrat from Michigan, disclosed that carbon monoxide is used to treat our meat to keep it looking fresh, and he says, I quote, treating meat with carbon monoxide gas allows it to look fresh even though it may have gone bad. Unfortunately, we're not going to win this battle legislatively. The answer is to vote with your pocketbook. The organic market is growing at 20% per year. Buy organics because it's healthy, and corporate America will follow the money. Now that you have a basic understanding of why your food is unhealthy and why it underpins virtually every major preventable illness, I want to turn our attention to politics, in particular to illegal immigration. We could stop illegal immigration in a heartbeat if we wanted to, but the federal government doesn't want to. Down below is an advertisement from National Beef Company where they were actually advertising in Mexico to bring workers to the United States to work in their plants. Since the governor of Arizona has made illegal immigration an issue, the government has started arresting illegal immigrants in order to show that they're quote-unquote doing something, but really, folks, that's just a scam. what they're not doing is what's more important than what they are doing. If they wanted to stop illegal immigration, all they'd have to do are the following. Start holding employers responsible for hiring undocumented workers. Secondly, mandatory jail time for all illegal immigrants entering the U.S. a second time. And thirdly, and most importantly, withdraw the invitation. No social services or entitlements for illegal immigrants. That means they can't send their children to school, they can't get health care, they can't buy a car, they can't buy a house, they can't get a job. If we take away the invitation, they will stop coming, pure and simple. Who does the government represent? The people or corporate America? I'm going to try to be politically correct here. Just because an individual held political office and at some point in time also happened to work for a major corporation doesn't mean that there's conflict of interest. However, if we find that the decisions coming out of Washington consistently favor the corporation that that individual worked for, then I believe it's reasonable to believe that there is in fact conflict of interest. We've been talking about food, and in that regard, one of the most powerful corporations in the world is Monsanto Chemical Company. With that, I want to look at the Bush and Clinton administrations. Rumsfeld was formerly CEO of GD Searle, which happens to be a Monsanto Chemical Company division. John Ashcroft, Missouri senator, happened to have received record donations from none other than Monsanto. And the Clinton administration, Robert Shapiro, was the president of Monsanto and also on President Clinton's advisory board. And Mickey Cantor happened to be U.S. Trade Representative and U.S. Secretary of Commerce and on the board of directors of Monsanto. The revolving door between government and corporate America. I'm not pointing the fingers at any of these individuals. However, one does have to wonder where their loyalties lie. Linda Fisher was Vice President of Government and Public Affairs for Monsanto. She later became the Deputy Administrator for the EPA. Wendell Murphy was on the Board of Directors of Smithfield and later became North Carolina State Senator. Margaret Miller was a chemical lab supervisor at Monsanto and later became FDA branch chief. Again, I know of nothing individually that these people have done, but what is conspicuous is the degree to which the government consistently favors Monsanto Chemical Company with the policies and decisions that are made. So let's take a look at how the legislation and court rulings over the last couple of decades have just coincidentally consistently favored Monsanto. It all began in 1980 when the U.S. Supreme Court ruled that you could patent life. That led to the current situation where farmers cannot save their own seed and are rapidly becoming totally dependent on Monsanto for the world's entire supply of grain. How insanely dangerous is that? Let's take a closer look at how Monsanto Chemical Company is systematically gaining a worldwide monopoly on grain production. It started when they introduced Roundup, a weed killer, and then followed it with the genetically engineered soybean that was resistant to Roundup. In 1996, they only had 2% of the U.S. soybean market, but by 2008, they had a staggering 90% of the domestic market. As it turns out, Mother Nature was their best friend. All they had to do was sell their soybeans to farmers on the west coast of the United States, and then the winds blowing from west to east cross-pollinated field after field with the genetic engineered soybean. Then farmers had to prove that they had not purchased Monsanto Chemical Company's products or they were liable for patent infringements. Let's take a look at another landmark decision that came out of the Supreme Court that just coincidentally favored Monsanto Chemical Company. One has to ask, is Lady Justice truly blind? The circumstances were that Clarence Thomas, former attorney for Monsanto Chemical Company, later became Supreme Court Justice and just happened to have written the majority opinion which prohibited farmers from saving soybean seeds for planting. The decision created a virtual monopoly for Monsanto. The family farmer is now powerless against the alliance of corporate, government, and judicial interest and cannot even save their own seeds. We have a monopoly on food rapidly developing where Monsanto Chemical Company will one day be able to determine whether we, the American people, and the people of the world have access to food or not. The Bible says a man can't serve two masters. It also says, judge a man by his fruit. So let's do exactly that. Michael Taylor worked for a King & Spalding law firm who happened to have Monsanto Chemical Company as a client. He later became Deputy Commissioner for Policy for the FDA. While at Spalding, he advised Monsanto on genetically modified food labeling. Then, while at the FDA, he turned around and oversaw the FDA's decision not to label genetically engineered foods. So folks, we don't even have the right to know if the foods that we are eating have been genetically altered and therefore may be in some fashion that we are unaware of harmful to our health. If you think that the federal government, and in particular the FDA, is safeguarding public health, you probably need to stop and think again. Here again we have two more examples of probable conflict of interest. We have a lobbyist for the beef industry, and we have a BP from the National Food Processors Association, influential in public decisions regarding our health. In 1972, the FDA conducted approximately 50,000 food safety inspections, but by 2006, they conducted only 9,164 inspections, and thanks to courts, the FDA doesn't have the power to shut down food processing plants even when contamination is found on repeated occasions. So clearly, folks, we have a situation here where the life and health of the American public is secondary to the profit of corporations. This is a particularly tragic story. It's the story of a 2-year-old, Kevin, who ingested 3 hamburgers and then died 12 days later of E. coli poisoning. Since his death in 2001, his mother has pursued a law called Kevin's Law, which would allow the FDA to close contaminated food plants. As I record this narration, it's June of 2011, and that law has yet to pass. Why? Apparently, our legislators are more concerned about protecting special interests than they are the rights of the American public. What makes the story even more tragic is it might have been averted. It turns out that Kevin died of a particularly virulent strain of E. coli called 157H7, which had its birth in the food lots. Scientists tend to believe that since cows were designed to eat grass and are now being fed corn, that the corn is causing them to develop vastly larger amounts of E. coli, and one of those strains mutated into this deadly strain. What makes the story even worse is that they know that if they were to remove the cattle from the feedlots and feed them grass for 2 weeks before going to the slaughter plant, that 80% of the E. coli in their body would be eliminated. But that costs too much money, so instead what they do is they send the beef to processing